Good evening, everybody. My name is Muna Kansi. I'm the manager of communications, programs, and events for the Cambridge Public Library. I welcome you to the main library on behalf of our administration and staff for this second lecture in the International Briefing series. The CPL International Briefing taps into the rich intellectual capital of area universities and colleges to provide analysis of current issues in states or regions in the news and from where many residents of Cambridge originate. Lectures in the series provide a progress report on events that have captured global attention, evaluate the international responses at the time, and examine the lessons learned. The briefing highlights the economic and political ramifications of these events for national and regional stability. The international briefing acknowledges the reality of an interdependent world. It promotes a better understanding of international affairs and serves as a counterweight to the movement towards isolationism that we see around the world. Our guest today is Professor Aviva Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. Her books include Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal, Beacon Press 2014, A History of the Cuban Revolution in 2011, the second edition printed in 2015, Linked Labor Histories, New England, Colombia and the Making of a Global Working Class in 2008, They Take Our Jobs and plenty other myths about immigration came out in 2007, West Indian Workers and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica, 1874 through 1940. This one came out in 1996. Professor Chomsky has also co-edited several anthologies, including The People Behind Colombian Coal, Mining, Multinationals and Human Rights, came out in 2000. The Cuba Reader, History, Culture, Politics, came out in 2003, second edition printed in 2019, as well as Identity and Struggle at the Margins of the Nation State, The Laboring Peoples of Central America and the Hispanic Caribbean, which was published in 1998. Professor Chomsky has been active in Latin American solidarity and immigrant rights movements for several decades. It is my honor to welcome Professor Aviva Chomsky to the Cambridge Public Library.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming tonight. I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about my history with Cuba, and then I'm going to go into the lecture part of the lecture. So I was born in 1957. I grew up learning to hide under my desk for the nuclear bomb alert attacks, whatever they were called. We had those drills, going down into the bomb shelter in the basement or hiding under your desk. We did those in school while I was growing up. I was too young to really be aware of the Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I do remember at one point during my childhood, my parents dressing up to go out to a Halloween party with my father dressed as Fidel Castro and my mother dressed as a sugarcane. I didn't get to go to the party. But I definitely grew up in a contradictory atmosphere of, on one hand, being imbued with Cold War ideology through school, through the media, through sort of everything. And on the other hand, being presented with a very critical attitude towards everything that I was hearing elsewhere in society in my home. So I had this sort of dual consciousness, perhaps growing up. I went to college at University of California, Berkeley in the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. So my college years were colored by the election of Ronald Reagan, the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979. I was in Berkeley, so there was a large Latin American population there. There were refugees coming in from Guatemala and El Salvador in the early 1980s. And I decided to, I did my undergraduate degree in Spanish and Portuguese and went on to get a PhD in Latin American history. I was troubled both by before I went into my graduate program, both by what was going on in the world, especially in Central America, trying to understand the revolutions there and understand why the United States was so bent on opposing the revolutions there. So I was distressed with what was happening, and I was also distressed with my own level of ignorance about what was happening. Despite my college degree, despite having lived through all these years, I still felt kind of abysmally ignorant. And this is why I decided to go on into Latin American history and get a PhD in Latin American history. Studying Latin American history, you quickly become aware of some issues that have been plaguing Latin America for centuries, really, issues of inequality, issues of racism, issues of US policy in Latin America, issues of revolution, and when I decided to study Central America because that was where the revolutions were happening, but because that was where the revolutions were happening, it also meant it was really difficult to do research there. So I ended up doing my dissertation and my research in a country that was not a Central American country that was not having a revolution, because my advisor told me to pick a topic that I could do in a year. And some of my colleagues who went on to do dissertations on El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala took 10 years. I only took 1 year to finish my dissertation on Costa Rica. It was a really easy country to do research in. But my preoccupation with revolution and understanding revolution, both why revolutions happen in Latin America, what revolutions try to do, and how the United States has tried to undermine revolution in Latin America, continued. And I ended up on my first sabbatical in the year 1994, 1995, deciding to travel to Cuba. And my historical research was on West Indian migrant workers in Central America who worked on US-owned banana plantations. Thus the title of my first book, if you pick that up, West Indian Workers and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica, 1870 to 1940. So I decided to sort of expand that research by looking at West Indian workers working for US companies in Cuba in the same time period, because this was the period when US companies were taking over Central America and the Caribbean, and they were moving workers around in order to staff their plantations. So, but while looking at doing the historical research on West Indian migrant workers, mostly from Haiti and Jamaica, working on US-owned sugar plantations in Costa Rica, in Cuba, I was also very fascinated, and this was one of the reasons why I wanted to study Cuban history, very fascinated with trying to understand the Cuban Revolution. So 1995, January of 1995, when I arrived there, was sort of the worst moment of what was known as the special period in Cuba, the economic collapse that happened after the fall of the USSR in 1989, 1991, this sort of pullback on Soviet trade and aid, which had comprised 85% of Cuba's economy, 85% of Cuba's trade, plus a huge amount of aid from the USSR, that had allowed the Cuban Revolution to create some really remarkable types of social reforms during the first 4 decades, 5 decades. It all fell apart, collapsed in 1991. And the period after 1991 was declared the special period in time of peace, special period referring to a wartime kind of mobilization of economic crisis and how to overcome that economic crisis. Things were changing very, very fast in Cuba. Things were really, really tough in Cuba when I arrived in 1995. When you hear about what's happening in Venezuela today, there's no food, there's no medicine, there's no electricity. That's kind of what it was like in Cuba in 1995 when I arrived. And the government was just beginning to implement a series of reforms to open the economy, to seek foreign investment, to try to recalibrate their entire economy and society to survive in a capitalist world without the aid of the Soviet Union that had allowed them to build a form of socialism in Cuba. Since then, I've been traveling to Cuba regularly, almost every year, every 2 or 3 years. I usually take student groups there now. I've also been many times to conferences and on subsequent research trips. And I kind of abandoned my historical research on the 19th and early 20th centuries to focus more on the Cuban Revolution and trying to understand it. So that has been a major focus of my research, of my travel, and of my writing and speaking over the last 20 years or so. When I thought about my title today, Why the Revolution Still Matters, I kind of pulled the title out of thin air, and then I thought, oh, so I have to figure out why the revolution still matters. So I was trying to sort of pull together my ideas, and I thought of 4 main themes that I want to talk about in terms of why the revolution still matters. And I'm going to show you some slides from my travels in Cuba that sort of try to explain some of these things. One, why the revolution still matters, that even though I'm guessing most people in this room believe that the Cold War ended a couple of decades ago, most of my students coming into my classrooms have no idea that the Cold War ever ended. They kind of vaguely know that Russia is our enemy. They kind of vaguely know that Russia is communist, and they kind of put those 2 things together. And like the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, they never got there in their history classes. So, but when you stop to think about it, in some ways, it's almost as if the Cold War didn't end. That is, from the perspective of the United States, and here I jump down to item number 4, US policy towards Latin America still seems to be fighting the Cold War. That is, the idea that a Latin American country could try to implement socialist policies, whether it's Haiti, whether it's Nicaragua, whether it's Venezuela, that's intolerable to the United States. Whether it's Honduras in 2009, it's intolerable to the United States. And the animosity that's whipped up towards the idea of socialism in Latin America in the United States, I think is matched only by the deep desire of many Latin Americans to find a different way that's not capitalism. Because capitalism in Latin America has not worked out very well for Latin Americans. What capitalism has brought in Latin America is exploitation, environmental destruction, poverty, coup d'etat, military dictatorships. Capitalism has not looked so pretty from the perspective of Latin America. Socialism, the idea that instead of foreign companies controlling your economy, your own government should control your economy, seems very attractive to many Latin Americans. And if you look at survey data, you'll find 60, 70, 80% of Latin Americans have a negative view of capitalism and a positive view of socialism. And when you look at what capitalism has meant in Latin America, it's kind of obvious as to why. So I would say that the Cuban Revolution still matters as the most successful example of a Latin American revolution that actually succeeded in implementing socialism in their country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also about 21st century socialism, and what are known as sort of the pink tide governments of the 21st century in Latin America, that have been experimenting with creating and implementing different kinds of socialism. And understanding that is, I think, one of the most exciting and provocative things about understanding Latin America today. Secondly, the concept of economic development and climate change. If we stop to think rationally about it, we have to acknowledge that our model of economic development is unsustainable. The model that we keep extracting more fossil fuel, we keep producing more things, our economy keeps growing, we keep raising the GDP by producing more things, and we keep consuming and throwing away more things. We keep producing, consuming, and throwing away more things. We're destroying the habitability of our planet. Like, we all know that on one level. And yet, on another level, we haven't wrapped our minds around what a different kind of economic development could look like. And I think that's one of the big debates facing us in the United States and planet-wide. What could economic development mean if it's not our model of economic development? Again, I think the Cuban Revolution and other socialist experiments in Latin America have tried to answer that question in different ways. And since the collapse of Cuba's economy, the country has also been experimenting with different ways of answering that question. Thirdly, race and identity, racial inequality. Third world anti-colonialism and Black liberation. To understand the history of racial justice movements in the United States, we have to acknowledge and understand their relationship with anti-colonial movements from the Haitian Revolution all the way up through the 20th century to the African liberation movements and to the Cuban Revolution. The relationship of racial justice and racial liberation movements in the first world to revolutions in the third world, and in particular, the Cuban Revolution, because of its internationalism, because of the role it played in leading the non-aligned movement, in supporting revolutionary movements elsewhere, in supporting liberation movements of people of color, colonized people of color, whether in the third world or in the first world, is another piece of why I think understanding the Cuban Revolution is so important. And there's a wonderful film made by a group of Yale students who traveled to Cuba, students of color at Yale. It's called Black in Cuba, that I really recommend if you haven't seen it yet. And finally, US policy. Obviously, all eyes now are on US policy towards Venezuela, and there's a lot of comparisons to be drawn between US policy towards Venezuela today and US policy towards Cuba, which in some ways was sort of the testing ground for a whole series of overthrows of popular democratically elected governments in Latin America, subsequent to the ongoing failure of the United States to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. Now, one might think that after, how many years has it been since 1991? Somebody who can subtract in their head, tell me? 28. After 28 years of capitalist reform in Cuba, the United States might be pulling back from its desire to overthrow the Cuban government and the Cuban economic system. Under the Obama administration, there were some tentative moves towards diplomatic recognition, towards visits, towards opening up travel, towards opening up trade. The Trump administration seems really bent on rolling back a lot of that. And one key piece of it that probably hasn't attracted as much attention as US policy towards Venezuela is attracting right now is the Helms-Burton law. Again, there's comparisons to Venezuela that I think are really important. Everybody knows what's going on in Venezuela and the US, right? Okay, so I can just mention that and you know what I'm talking about. I don't think that would be true in my classes, but. In the depths of the economic collapse in Cuba, in 1996, the year after I first went there and saw with my own eyes what this economic collapse looked like, the United States passed, the Congress passed the Helms-Burton legislation, which was signed by President, what was his name? Clinton. Carter, it wasn't Carter, Clinton, to vastly expand and tighten the US embargo on Cuba. As Henry Kissinger said, with regard to Chile under Allende, we wanted to make the economy scream. And if you look back, and this is one of the areas that I've done a little bit of research in, classified US government documents from the early years of the Cuban Revolution, the United States is absolutely committed to making the Cuban Revolution fail. And economic sabotage is one of the set of policies that they carry out in order to try to make the Cuban Revolution fail. Well, as the economy is collapsing in the mid-1990s, the Helms-Burton legislation tightens the economic embargo that has been in place for years. The Cubans, by the way, call it a blockade instead of an embargo, because an embargo would prohibit U.S. trade relations with Cuba. They call it a blockade because it attempts to impose itself extraterritorially, that is, to punish other countries that engage in trade with Cuba. So that's why the Cubans call it a blockade rather than just an embargo. But Helms-Burton greatly increased the extraterritorial reach, and some aspects of Helms-Burton were so patently detrimental to any kind of sanity that every U.S. president has periodically suspended them. Just last week, President Trump announced that that these pieces of the Helms-Burton legislation, the very draconian Helms-Burton legislation of 1996, were actually now going to be implemented. So the United States is still trying to tighten the economic embargo on Cuba, at the same time that, of course, it's much more vocally tightening the economic embargo on Venezuela. The idea that an economic embargo could in any way be helpful to the people of any Latin American country is just mind-boggling. Okay, so those are my themes, and I'll be kind of referring to them as we go through. So Sandra Ramos is a Cuban artist. The caption on this painting that she did in 1993 is El sueño del profeta, the dream of the prophet. Any Cuban would immediately recognize the kind of ghostly figure in the center as José Martí. José Martí is known as the father of the Cuban independence movement, but he's kind of more than that. That is, to find there's no real comparable figure in U.S. history, but in order to get one, we would have to, I think, put together George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And that's an important combination because the Cuban War of Independence, unlike the American War of Independence, was also a war against slavery and a war against racism. José Martí, as the main sort of theoretician of the Cuban independence movement in the 1890s, and a very prolific writer and honored by Cubans on both sides of the Florida Straits, wrote he was a white descendant of Spaniards, but wrote some things that were really remarkable for a white intellectual in the 1890s to be writing. He wrote that to be Cuban comes before being black, before being white, before being mulatto. He wrote that race is an invention created to divide people. He wrote that a free Cuba is going to be Cuba with all and for the good of all. So I would say he even went beyond Abraham Lincoln in terms of predicating the idea of the formation of a Cuban nation on racial equality. So José Martí is everywhere in Cuba. Every school you go into, there's a bust of José Martí. His words are everywhere. But this painting does what sort of the mainstream ideology in Cuba tries to do, which is to argue that the Cuban War of Independence failed because Cuba did not become independent in 1898. It ended its war occupied by the United States, and the United States imposed on Cuba what they call neo-colonial rule. This meant that they were still subject to foreign powers, that their economy was still controlled from the outside, that they were still producing sugar for the benefit of foreign planters, that they had no economic independence, and that the racial inequalities of the United States were superimposed on Cuba. So although slavery ended, exploited black workers were still working on the plantations, producing sugar for the profits of US investors. So neither the dream of national independence, economic independence, social equality, or racial equality was achieved in 1898 with Cuban independence. Instead, Cuba was a neo-colony where all of the ills of colonialism, including the economic exploitation of the country and the social and racial inequalities built into that economic exploitation of the country, were simply reproduced now by the United States instead of by Spain. So the dream of the prophet was not realized in 1898. Martí himself was killed in 1895 in the war. His dream was not achieved until 1959. And the revolutionaries of 1959 very openly invoked José Martí, that is, we are now finally fighting to achieve social equality and national independence. Those two must go together. We need to control our own national destiny. We need to control our own economy in order to create social and racial equality, to finally create José Martí's dream of a Cuba with all and for the good of all. A couple of other things. Do you think we could turn down the lights in front? Does anybody know how to do that? I suspect it's right here. Oops. Uh-oh. You think we're going to get it back? Okay. So just imagine that painting up there in front of you. I'm going to keep talking about it, even though it's gone. I wanted you to see it better, not worse. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. Thank you. So I also just wanted to draw your attention to what's on the two sides of José Martí. To the right side of José Martí, you see, of course, the island of Cuba. You see the royal palm, which is the national tree. You see the palm and the flag going together, that is national independence, and you see them planted in Santiago de Cuba, in the easternmost part of the island. And Santiago de Cuba is very important, I would say, for three reasons. One is that eastern Cuba is black Cuba. Eastern Cuba is where the sugar plantations were located, where the majority of the population, the culture, the identity, that is the heartland of black Cuba, is Eastern Cuba. Eastern Cuba is also revolutionary Cuba. And the role of Cuba's Afro-descended population, both in the War of Independence, where they were fighting for freedom from slavery. Officially, it had been abolished a few years before, but freedom from economic exploitation, freedom from racism, and national freedom, that is, for Cuba's Afro-descended population, those two automatically went together. Eastern Cuba is also the heartland of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. When the Spanish surrendered in Santiago de Cuba, in 1898, the US Army entered and would not let the Cuban army take control. And when Fidel Castro was victorious in the city of Santiago de Cuba, marched in 1950, the end of 1958, he said, "We are not going to let this happen again. This time, the Cubans are taking control." So the sort of revitalization of that that notion that autonomy and independence come from the heartland of black Cuba. I think all of that is sort of seen here in the planting of the flag and the tree there in Santiago. On the other side of José Martí, we see the other part of his dream. The little girl is wearing a school uniform. Education is free from the cradle to the grave in Cuba. It's public. There's no private education at all. One of the first things that was abolished after the triumph of the revolution in 1959 was the unequal education system. And anywhere you go in Cuba, you're going to see little girls and little boys, their uniforms slightly different, walking around in these uniforms, which are also free, as are the textbooks and everything else. So the leveling of social inequalities through the provision of education and health care. That is, those were the two major triumphs of the Cuban Revolution in many ways, and where Cuba really excels by Latin American standards in terms of educational levels, the eradication of illiteracy, the absolute access of the population to education, and in healthcare advances and access of the entire population to all levels of healthcare, again, at no cost. So this is what socialism looks like. It doesn't look that bad. And the little girl, in addition to going to school, you can kind of see her healthy-looking face and her fat cheeks and her kind of racial indeterminacy. I think all of that is sort of part of the idea of the dream of the prophet and the implication that it's the revolution that has achieved this dream. Another quote by José Martí on this billboard in Santa Clara. This is actually one of my students from Salem State took this and some of the subsequent photos. Until very recently, again, there's been this sort of incursion of capitalism in the last few years, but until very recently, their advertising simply did not exist in Cuba. There was no such thing. There basically was no private economy. Nobody ever tried to get you to buy anything. There wasn't a whole lot to buy either, but with health, education, free transportation, free utilities, free childcare, free elder care, what do you even need money for? Anyway, but there's a lot of revolutionary billboard propaganda art gracing the streets and the sides of buildings and everything else. This one is a quote by José Martí. It says, "O libres para siempre, o batallando siempre para ser libres," either free forever or forever fighting to be free. And you have the racial equality, the idea, again, harking back to José Martí of blacks and whites together, shackled together by colonialism, fighting together for Cuba and for freedom. And the idea that Cuba still has to fight for freedom is constantly reinforced by the US animosity towards Cuba. The Plaza de la Revolución, here this sort of iconic image of Che Guevara saying, "Hasta la victoria siempre," until victory forever, with the Cuban flag. And then the commitment to healthcare. This is a quote not from José Martí, but from Che Guevara, from a piece that he wrote, El Médico Revolucionario, the revolutionary doctor. Che Guevara was, of course, a doctor. But again, the absolute commitment to providing healthcare and education. And if you think about what most of us are worried about here in this room, probably healthcare and education, at least for our children, if not for ourselves, are going to be pretty high up there on the list. Like, what do we have access to? What do we need access to? What kind of ruin threatens our futures? It has to do, a lot of it, with healthcare and education, right? Do all of your children have health insurance? One of mine doesn't. They turn 26, they get cut off yours. Anyway, so the quote from Che Guevara, I'll just do the literal translation. It's not very grammatical, but in case you're following along with the Spanish, "It is worth but millions of times more the life of a single human being than all of the properties of the wealthiest man in the world." So the life of a single human being is worth more than the properties of all the richest man in the world. Cuba also, the Cuban Revolution and Cuba really stand out in Latin America in terms of a struggle that has been going on everywhere in Latin America since 1492 between the values of the Catholic Church and other desires for social change. In some cases, the Catholic Church has been very involved in and committed to movements of the poor and movements for social change. But in the area of sex education, reproductive rights, gender equality, the Catholic Church has not tended to be a progressive force in Latin America. However, with the Cuban Revolution, being atheist, they were able to simply sweep away the church's influence. And Cuba has an incredible reproductive health, safe sex education program. Just a couple of kind of lighthearted posters. Both of these are from a family doctor's office. And there's family doctor's office on every single street corner in every single neighborhood in the entire island. The one on the left says a couple's best friend. So they're the sort of romantic scene, and they're taking instead of their dog, they have their little condom that they're carrying with them. And on the right-hand side, you see the legs of the two lovers, and then in between them, the little childish figure saying, "Hey, hey, don't begin without me," which is the childish figure being the condom. So, so one of our students asked, so when does sex education begin in Cuba? To one of the family doctors in this office where we were sitting under this mural promoting breastfeeding, lactancia materna. And it's as you can see, it's a low-tech mural. Most of it is made by hand. Some of it was printed up, but it was like pieces pasted on by hand. So one of the students said, "Oh, so when does sex education begin in Cuba?" And the doctor looked kind of puzzled, and she said, "It begins with their one-week appointment. Like when they come in, like this is on the wall. All of this is on the wall." So kicking out the multinationals means there's no formula companies trying to press their wares on Cuban women. And this is the Literacy Museum, founded to commemorate the literacy campaign, which was one of the first early campaigns in 1961, was called the Year of Overcoming Illiteracy and mobilization of the educated population, mostly youth in the cities, to go out into the rural areas and teach people to read. And at the end of the year, Cuba was declared a territory free of illiteracy. The busts on the wall are the martyrs of the literacy campaign. That is, by 1961, the United States was already very active in funding and arming a counter-revolution in Cuba to try to overthrow the revolution. And there were a number of brigadistas, young people who went out on the brigades, who were killed by counter-revolutionary forces. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip that one. But I won't skip it. Cubans Vote. We may not like the options they have in their elections. We may not like the options we have in our elections. We may not like their system. We may not like our system. However, Cubans do vote. They vote regularly, and there's popular consultations at the national level that go on in all kinds of different ways. But we were there during an electoral period, and one of my delegations, this is in 2015, so this is a poster trying to motivate people to go out and vote. And I can talk more about how the electoral system works there if you want. I've also traveled several times to the Bay of Pigs, which, of course, we remember as a failure. The Cubans remember it as a success because it was the first great defeat of Yankee imperialism in Latin America. The only great defeat of Yankee imperialism in Latin America. And this means a lot to Latin Americans, most of whose countries have in fact been invaded by or subject to coups, military coups, and military dictatorships supported by the United States. So this one just says, the mercenaries came up to here. This is in Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs region. So this was how far the troops that landed were actually able to get in from the water where they landed. And this is right outside the museum to the Bay of Pigs, which is always an interesting experience to see it from the perspective of the other side. This was right down the street from the apartment that we rented illegally, because there was no such thing as legally renting an apartment. Property was not for rent or for sale in Cuba when I was there in 1995. Now it is. Now it's really easy to stay at an Airbnb or a hotel. But at that time, there was no private rentals allowed at all. But we illegally traveled to Cuba, first of all, from the US perspective. That is, we weren't allowed to go there. And from the Cuban perspective, we did a lot of things that were illegal too, but things that belong to what are generally considered the gray economy, the gray market. And there was a lot of gray market activity going on in 1995, and a lot of it has gradually became legalized. I say gray as opposed to the black market. So these were things where everybody knew they were happening. The authorities kind of winked at them. They were technically illegal, but everybody did them. But this was a mural right down the street from where I lived, commenting on the economic crisis. So I just want to mention a couple of things about it. One, people say there's no freedom of expression in Cuba. There is lots of freedom of expression in Cuba. My students have never heard so much and such articulate complaining about the government as they did in Cuba. They said, what? I never heard people in the United States who know that much about everything that's going on in their country and have such strong opinions about it. So we see somebody who's not very happy with hunger, but they're also not very happy with what capitalism is bringing to Cuba. We see some not very friendly looking tourists coming into the country. We see tourists bringing prostitution. We see the Cuban flag being sucked up into a Coca-Cola sign. We see the US dollar. We see people leaving on rafts. We see people very hungry. We see Che Guevara with for sale, $7. We see people on the right-hand side going back to riding bicycles. I thought I was in heaven. There were no cars on the street, only hundreds and hundreds of bicycles. But I think I was the only person in Havana who felt that way. Everybody else wanted their cars back. We see farmers who have had to go back to using hand tools because there's no petroleum. And we see the Cuban flag coming down the middle, kind of being overwhelmed with all of these things. One of the openings to capitalism that happened in Cuba was an opening to dollars, an opening to remittances, so that Cubans who had relatives abroad suddenly had access to money that Cubans who did not have relatives abroad didn't have. So we start to see, with the coming back of capitalism, the replication of pre-revolutionary economic inequalities. We have the socialist sector becoming more and more impoverished. It's a government-run store for rationed goods, and you see the kind of empty shelves. Like, you still have your ration card, you still have the right, in theory, to a subsistence diet, but if you go to the store and there's no food there, your ration card doesn't do you any good. And you see the beautiful opening to capitalism in the private farmers markets that were authorized in the late 1990s, where they're increasing production, beautiful produce, but many people can't afford it. This is the problem with capitalism, and this is why capitalism in Latin America has been such a failure. You have the opening of dollar stores once the dollar is legalized, where there's lots of imported goods. If you have dollars, you can get them. If you don't have dollars, you can't. That feels really unjust to Cubans. It can sound unjust to us when we describe it that way, but it's basically what happens here too, right? We have beautiful stores filled with lots of food, but if you don't have dollars, you can't buy it. And I just like this photo because everybody always says, oh, Cuba is stuck back in time, like nothing has changed, it's all like pre-1959. So much has changed in Cuba since 1959. It's true that there are still some pre-1959 cars in Cuba, but there's also, so I like this because it's the 3 generations of cars. This is right outside the airport when we first landed. Of course, the billboard promoting the socialist revolution, and then you have the old car in the middle, the old American pre-1959 car. In the front, you have a Soviet Lada, which the country was flooded with in the 1970s, 1980s. And in the back, I can't actually identify that car, maybe somebody here can, but it's a brand new, like, capitalist era car, which are being imported. And actually, now cars are also available on the free market in Cuba. Those ladas, those were given out by the state to high need sectors, people who needed those cars for their work, who like that was part of their work, was having to drive things and people places. So there was no private market in cars. Now there is, but only if you can afford it. I want to stop because I want to give you, this is my last slide, and I do want to give you a chance for questions. But just in the past weeks, a new constitution has been approved in Cuba. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of the aspects of this new constitution. One, that it was debated for over a year in island-wide public meetings so that everybody was engaged in this process of talking about what the new constitution would consist of. It was approved by the National Assembly, which is an elected body. The new constitution limits presidential power in a number of different ways, including limiting the number of terms that a president can serve. It's now 2. Expands freedom of assembly, eliminates free child and elder care, can't afford it in a capitalist economy. It preserves free education and health care. It expands anti-discrimination, but not marriage equality. And that was a concession to the Catholic Church, which also in this post-socialist era has been gaining more power and more of a voice in Cuban society. And this is not always a good thing for progressive Cubans. So I'm going to end there. Maybe we should turn the lights back on. I'm afraid to touch anything now. But I would love to take some questions. Yes. Oh, is this working? Yeah, I just have to hold it close. Okay, yes.
I have lots of questions and comments, so thank you very much for your presentation. But one thing that I would like to mention first is that I don't think it was the Catholic Church that opposed marriage equality. I think it was the evangelicals.
It was actually both.
Anyway, but if you could comment a little bit about race in Cuba. And I say this from the perspective that it's so evident in everything that we do in the United States. And because we as Americans go to Cuba and bring our U.S. baggage with us, we see things there the way we see them here. So, for instance, in talking and going again back into the 90s, in talking about race, Cubans would always say, oh, we're all the same, we're all mixed, we all have African blood. Cuba is an African country, as demonstrated by liberation in Africa, where Cuba said we didn't bring back.
Hold on for just a second. Can everyone hear? You can? Okay.
We didn't bring back gold and jewels or wealth, only the bones of our fallen comrades. But with the economic crisis of the special period, with the economic crisis of the special period, people had access to remittances from abroad, and those were primarily white people who left and came to the United States and were economically able to. And I know that Cuba took great strides to somewhat level the playing field, so to speak, but there's still a lingering feeling, and again, especially among Americans, that that racism in Cuba is not just doesn't still exist, but that it's strong and deep. So could you comment on that a little bit? Because that's something that I struggle with people when I'm in Cuba. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let me talk about both the Cuban Revolution, that is the first decade, say 1959 to 1989, and then what's happened since the special period, and we could call it the capitalization of the Cuban economy. So the Cuban Revolution did make eliminating racism and eliminating racial inequality a top priority. And the use of the image of José Martí to justify this contributes to what you were saying, that Cubans say, we're just all Cuban. They quote José Martí, being Cuban comes before being white, before being black, before being mulatto. Don't bring your racial ideologies from the United States. Don't impose them on us. We're first Cuban. Don't tell me I'm Afro-Cuban. I'm Cuban. And so the Cuban Revolution's commitment to overcoming and eliminating racial inequality was carried out in a number of different ways. And remember, this is 1959. That is, Boston schools were still segregated for several decades after the time we're talking about here. So eliminating all legal segregation, of which there was a lot, and also eliminating all de facto segregation, like Boston's, for example, where, but the de facto segregation was built in so deeply that we had a court order requiring that we desegregate our schools in Boston in the late 1970s. So public beaches are open to everyone. Public facilities are open to everyone. Equalizing economic opportunity, which has a lot to do with overcoming racial injustice, because racial injustice is economic injustice in many ways. That is, race and class cannot be separated under a system of racial capitalism. So creating equality of opportunities for all children to have access to quality school and quality preschool and quality health care and enough food, those things overcome racial inequalities. And some of the results of this, and this has been, of course, studied, Cuba is the only country in the world where there is no difference by race in infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates. The United States has yawning gaps. So in some ways, especially in the areas where the Cuban Revolution was most successful, in health and education, access, one could say that racial inequality was overcome, but not in all ways, especially in some of the areas where the Cuban Revolution has been less successful. One of those is housing. The Cuban Revolution has never succeeded in providing, it succeeded overwhelmingly in providing health care and education for its population. It's never succeeded in providing adequate housing for all of its population. And even though there were huge urban reforms, rental properties were all confiscated, everything was owned by the government, you couldn't pay more than 10% of your income in rent, and then most rental properties were turned over to the people who were living in them. So there was huge reforms in the areas of housing policy, but residential patterns were very deep. And residential segregation is still obvious in Cuba. Another area in which you still really see racial inequality is in criminality. Who do the police stop? Who is arrested? Who spends more time in jail? Under those statistics, Cuba does not look like a country that has overcome racial inequality. It looks more like the United States and Brazil. So this is the heyday of the Cuban Revolution. Now we have the 1989, the collapse of the economy, the special period, the coming in of capitalism. So you mentioned one really important part of that, which is remittances. That is, if you had relatives abroad, for the first 40 years of the Cuban Revolution, you were a gusano, a worm, suspect, because your relatives were counter-revolutionaries who left. After 1993, all of a sudden, you're privileged if you have relatives abroad who are making money because they can send money back to you. And that's why I was just showing you the buildings that have been painted next to the buildings that haven't been painted or renovated, not just painted. So you're absolutely right. That is, Cuban Miami is much whiter than Cuba itself. The outflow of the elites after 1959 created a Cuban Miami that is overwhelmingly white, and it also darkened Cuba itself because so many white people left. But now it's the relatives of those people who left, and especially the first generation of people who left, who tended to come more from the elites. Subsequent generations of people who left in the 1980s, 1990s, have a racial profile much more similar to the country as a whole. But the first people to leave in the 1960s, and the ones who were the most economically successful, that is, can send the most remittances, are overwhelmingly white. Their relatives in Cuba are also overwhelmingly white. So that's one of the ways that racial inequalities reproduce themselves even after 40 years as capitalism starts to return. But there's other ways as well. The tourist industry has created a vast inequality of opportunity based on race. Hotels, foreign-owned hotels, want to hire people who they think foreign tourists want to engage with, people with buena presencia, people who look right, and those people have lighter skin. People with darker skin are racialized as providing certain types of services for tourists, whether it's art, whether it's dance, whether it's music, the Afro-Cuban experience that tourists want access to. So Black Cuban identity is folklorized to be sold to tourists. Prostitution, also. A lot of tourists want, or are told they want once they get to Cuba, people of color who they can purchase sex from. That's part of the dream that foreign Europeans and Americans go to Cuba with, the sexy mulattoes and mulatas. So the coming in of foreign investment, tourism as well as remittances, all of those things, that is, Cuba exists in a world that is racially unequal. And the more it opens up to that capitalist world, and the more that capitalist world encroaches on Cuba, the more those racial inequalities. But again, the Cuban Revolution did not eliminate racial inequalities. They overcame racial inequalities in some areas, but not in other areas. I'm going to try to answer these questions more quickly, because I know we only have until 8 o'clock. So, why don't you hand the mic? Yeah, you choose the.
What do you think the role for American citizens is in terms of, say, criticizing Cuba versus criticizing what America is doing to Cuba? Because many people will say, oh, well, Cuba doesn't have X, Y, Z, the dictatorship, and we're fighting for freedom, but then that's used against Cuba, and maybe actually people in America should focus on the international crimes America's doing in the embargo, as called blockade. So do you think Americans should just keep silent about whatever's wrong going on in Cuba and focus on what's wrong in America, or do you think there's some balance, or should they, try to help Cubans by joining with whatever Cubans say you should do? I'm just curious. I can see many sides of this.
So first of all, I think Americans should go to Cuba. I think you should see Cuba with your own eyes, and you should talk to as many Cubans as you can. And that's why I just love taking student groups to Cuba. So, before I went to Cuba in 1995, I read everything possible. I mean, I was a historian. That's what you do, right? You read everything before you go somewhere. And when I got to Cuba, I had no idea what was in store for me. That is, everything that I read about Cuba did not prepare me. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do the Cuba Reader and start writing about Cuba, too. Because, and believe it or not, like, I was an adult. I had a PhD. I was a professor. I had 2 kids. I was surprised that Cuba was like a technicolor, like multicolored country. I thought it was going to be black and white. I literally imagined Cuba like what you see on a black and white TV screen. I couldn't believe how colorful it was. And that was me. So And so, yes, you have to go to Cuba and see it for yourself before you can even start to answer that question. Everything, and the other thing is, the longer you stay in Cuba, the more confusing it's going to get to you. So don't think you can understand what's going on in Cuba if you go there for a week. The joke is, if you go to Cuba for a week, you learn enough to write a book. If you go for a month, you learn enough to write an article. And if you go for a year, you learn enough to know that you'll never be able to write anything about Cuba. So Cuba is an extraordinarily complex society. And the idea that America, so I think everybody should go for a week, because I doubt that many people are going to be able to go for a month or a year, but if you can, you should also go for a month or a year. But when you go for a week, absorb everything you can, but don't think that now you know everything about Cuba, so you have the right to make decisions about what Cubans should do for themselves. Any more than if you go to France for a week, you think you should know enough to decide what the French should do for themselves. I do think that our job here is to focus on the harm that our government is causing in Cuba. That, to me, is our moral responsibility here. So I am absolutely fascinated with trying to understand everything that's happening in Cuba. That's why I keep reading about it. That's why I keep writing about it. That's why I keep going back. That's why I keep taking people back. But I don't feel that I know enough to tell Cubans what I think they should do with their country. But I do think that Cubans should have the right to decide what they want to do with their country.
I want to say, primarily, I want to thank you for the lecture. However, when you spoke about the political part of Cuba within your lecture, I felt kind of absent. So it begged me to ask the question. You spoke on Fidel, the late commander of the Republic. However, you didn't speak much about the non-aligned movement and how you failed to mention how he was part of the non-aligned movement and the leader of it. However, he was also an ally of the Soviet Union, a country that was, you know, supported a lot of communist nations across the world, primarily the Eastern Bloc and a lot of Latin American nations. And I thought that, you know, I wanted to hear your thoughts on how you thought that that could have been planned out, and how, did you think he was a hypocrite in doing so or not at all? And my second question was more of an economic one. You spoke of the embargo or the blockade, and how it was imposed on Cuba and how it hindered its progression. But I knew you spoke about the expropriation of the land in Cuba and the private property, but I wanted to ask, have you ever reconsidered your stance on the economic side, considering, you know, the expropriation of the private property and lands across Cuba could have hindered its progression as well? Yeah, that was my two questions.
Okay, let me see if I can start with the first one, the non-aligned movement. That is, the non-aligned movement was made up primarily of countries that had been colonized by capitalist countries, right, by Europe and the United States, that had fought for their independence and in different ways fought for their independence, and gained independence from colonialism, and wanted to find a different, a space in the world for former colonies that did not force them into the Cold War. Now, the United States and the capitalist European countries were the colonizers, right? 500 years of colonialism were carried out by the United States and the European capitalist countries. So countries that are fighting for independence in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, they're fighting against the capitalist countries. And in many of those countries, communist and socialist movements played a big role in the anti-colonial struggles. So socialism and communism are connected with national liberation throughout the colonized world. You can't find an example of an anti-colonial movement that does not have links with socialist and communist parties and ideologies. However, the non-aligned movement did not want to become colonies of the USSR. They did not want to become part of the Comintern. They did not want to be part of the Cold War that was mostly being fought in their countries. That is, the Cold War was not cold for the people of Vietnam. It was not cold for the people of Korea. It was not cold for the people of Greece. It was not cold for the people of Chile. I could go on and on. It was not cold because the United States and the former colonial powers were and still are fighting that Cold War against communism and socialism in countries like Venezuela right now. So I guess I have to say I don't see a contradiction. I see a historical process in which anti-communism becomes a way of fighting against national liberation in colonized countries. Over and over and over and over and over again in the post-World War II period. Now you're going to have to remind me of your other question. I knew this would happen. Whichever one I answered first, I would forget the other one.
No problem. The economic part, you spoke of the embargo or the blockade that was imposed on Cuba by America. And you did speak heavily on it, but...
Okay, I remember the question.
Okay,
thanks. Yeah. So you were asking if I thought Cuba would have progressed more if it hadn't expropriated properties?
Yeah, and nationalized the industries. Yeah.
So the desire to have state control, so I mean, over the course of the 1960s, expropriation progressed in Cuba. At first, it was an agrarian reform, right? Foreign-owned properties over a certain size that were not being used, productively. Then there was a second agrarian reform later in 1962. Then there was an urban reform. And by 1968, pretty much all private enterprise had been taken over by the state. What a lot of Cubans were saying in the early 1990s, as capitalism is starting to come back in, economic reforms allowing private enterprise are going on, foreign investment is being invited into Cuba again. There was a lot of discussion on the streets and in academic journals and in the newspapers in Cuba about what does this mean and what kind of capitalism can we have? What kind of private enterprise can we have that's going to be good for the country? I think most progressive Cubans took foreign investment as a necessary evil, not because they wanted it, not because they thought it was going to be good for Cuba, but because they felt they had no option given the crisis situation. But many thoughtful progressive Cubans felt that the state control of the economy, that the prime sectors of the economy should be kept under state control, but that small-scale private enterprise, at the local small-scale private ownership of the means of production could work a lot better. And you really see this in the streets of Cuba. Now that small-scale private enterprise has been legalized, this flourishing of economic activity, of people making pizza in their house and selling it, of people opening up little living room restaurants in their front patios. So, you know, Cuba, after 1968, probably came closer than any other place in the world ever has to completely doing away with the private sector. But almost every country has both. It has a private sector and it has a public sector. The United States, we call ourselves a capitalist country, right? But we still have a public sector. Even after 20 years of neoliberalism, we still have a public sector. I teach at a public university. We have public schools. We have public libraries. Most of us like having a public sector. Most of us believe that certain key sectors of the economy should be equally accessible to all, not only those that have dollars. That's why we have public schools and public libraries, and I mean, you're all here. You must support the idea of public libraries. I certainly do. So the question is, I think, finding a balance. I would guess if I were to take a poll here, at least half of the people in this room would say that they think our healthcare system should be nationalized. Maybe the other half doesn't. It's Cambridge, maybe more than half do. But generally, societies create a public sector for what they think is so important that it should not be left to the vagaries of the capitalist market, that it shouldn't be only for people who have dollars, that it should be for everybody. That's why we have public schools. So part of the question is, what is that important? Is food that important? Like, is food that important that we should really guarantee everyone the right to food? That we should make food publicly available? Apparently we don't think that as a society. Apparently we don't think that about healthcare. Other capitalist countries do think that about healthcare. So it's not a yes or no question. It's a question of degree, I think. What kind of society do we want to have? What do we want? What do we think everybody should have a right to? You have the mic, so. Can you put it closer? Still can't hear you. It should have an on button.
I'd like it very much if you would comment on political corruption / economic corruption, both during the Castro regime and also what you suspect could be happening now with this gradual transformation into the capitalist world. Because I think many of us in this room have just hit the wall with seeing how corrupt the government has become, how money
The government,
interest,
you mean the
moneyed
US government or the
interest
Cuban
really-
government?
Huh?
You mean the US government or the Cuban government?
Yes, the U.S. government. How moneyed interests, and let's call it late-stage capitalism, have taken over, in many ways, the political life of our country. And, you know, hearing this, what you're saying now, it has me worried that I hope there's a way to prevent this kind of thing from happening to Cuba, if it hasn't happened already. And that's why I ask about the Castro regime. I can't imagine people having that amount of power and not being corrupt.
So most of the studies that have been done, and you can also see it in everyday life, just walking around the streets, found very low levels of corruption and inequality, very low levels of inequality in Cuba compared to practically anywhere else in the world. Now, there's no place that is completely free of corruption, right? But I remember visiting, I guess it was in a hospital, and the doctor, on one of the groups that I took, and the doctor talking about his commitment to his work, and one of the students saying, you know, you could make so much more money working in the tourist economy. How does Cuba, like, educate people like you who just, like, want to, like, have this mission and want to, like, serve your people? And he said, well, you have to start by looking in the daycare centers. But, you know, Che Guevara proposed in the 1960s that Cuba would create, that he wasn't talking about corruption specifically, but he was talking about, like, materialism, like the fact that the idea that people are motivated by material gain, that is a distortion of the human spirit created by capitalism. And that Cuba was going to create the new man, the socialist man, who is motivated by love, by commitment, by wanting to be part of creating a more just society. Now, when you say that, it sounds like utopian and ridiculous. But in fact, don't we all think that we're capable of being motivated by something more than just material gain? Like, don't you all think that? So, I mean, a lot of how we are shaped by the society that we are shaped by, grow up in. I mean, I do, and if you look at the history of human societies, like capitalism and profit and materialism are actually kind of new in human history. That is, most people during most of human history lived in economies and societies that were based on sharing, on redistribution, on constant redistribution of resources, and that survival depended on solidarity with other people in your village or your clan or your tribe, and this sort of constant redistribution of resources. So I think we're capable of more than we think we might be capable of. Definitely, Cuba is so much more unequal now than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And, you know, that doctor was talking about his decision to stay in the medical profession. Many doctors have left to work in the tourist economy. That's not necessarily an example of corruption. I mean, all of us make decisions based on our context and what's available to us. And it's a lot easier to be generous and motivated by love when you know you're always going to have enough. And you don't have to worry about sending your kids to college and your retirement and your medical bills. And it's a lot easier to value other things when you know that your basic needs are going to be fulfilled.
Yet the direction they're going in is to take away care for little children and for the elderly. And that's striking to me. That's like the American government. Something's awry. The priorities there. What's happening?
Well, another thing that I have to tell you is that every time I've been away from Cuba for a while and I think about it, it looks really discouraging. And every time I go to Cuba, I come back so inspired. So, I mean, I don't think that Cuba is going to become another Haiti. I don't think Cuba's going to become another Dominican Republic. I don't think Cuba's going to become another United States. I don't think anybody knows what Cuba's going to be 10 years from now. I certainly don't. I don't think anybody else does either.
Testing. Okay. So I was wondering if you could, right here.
I don't see you. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could comment on Castro's initial prognosis with, say, his Cuban Revolution, when he thought at the time that we wouldn't have just socialism in one country, as sometimes people refer to the Soviet Union or China. And he acknowledged his situation of leading a bunch of ragtag peasants as having much more in common with, say, China, with Mao, than, say, the revolutions of 1917 through 19, where there was a much more flourishing civil society that created the conditions for the working class, not, say, peasants, to be primarily the vehicle for the revolution. And Castro is very optimistic in his prognosis initially, but over time, like, say, during the Cold War, you do have, say, Castro becoming a Cuban nationalist, and you have him do things like explicitly not back the FML in El Salvador, etc. And so would you say that in light of this and the fact that there is a sort of decided retreat after the years where he becomes more inwardly focused towards, say, socialism in Cuba and advocating the goal of socialism worldwide, do you think his initial prognosis was too optimistic? And how might this shape your definition of socialism as you gave it in your presentation? Thank you.
Well, that's a really big question, but let me address some pieces of it. I mean, one thing is that the Cuban Revolution is very sui generis. It has followed its own path. Socialism or communism in Cuba looks very, very different from what it looked like in the USSR or in China. There were no mass famines in Cuba. There were no gulags in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution was always nationalist. It wasn't until several years into the revolution that Fidel Castro declared himself a socialist and said this revolution is socialist. Even the United States, it's really hilarious if you go back and look at what some of the US ambassadors and people on the ground there in Cuba were saying. But one US official, I can't remember who it was, described a meeting that he had with Fidel Castro in 1960. And so he was sending back information to the State Department and said, I kept trying to impress upon him how important the Cold War was and how the United States has to defend freedom against the Soviet Union and how terrible communism was. But he just didn't seem interested. He kept talking to me about what the Cuban people needed and how he wanted to make reforms that would be good for the Cuban people. And you know, this U.S. official is like so bewildered that Fidel Castro just can't seem to understand how important the Cold War is. So I think the Cuban Revolution has always been nationalist. I don't think that's but it's also always been internationalist, but it's been internationalist in wanting to support liberation struggles around the world. Of course, Cuba also has to engage in realpolitik. That is, it also has to survive in the world that it lives in. And by the 1980s, it was really clear that it could only be that to actually get militarily involved in other countries' liberation struggles, which it did in Africa in the 1970s, but that nothing good could come out of getting militarily involved in Central America. And I don't think it would have helped the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Salvadoran Revolution, the Guatemalan Revolution. I think the context is so different. Those revolutionary movements were also nationalist. I don't think they wanted to be taken over by the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution didn't want to take them over. So, I don't know, your question had a lot of parts to it, but I don't know if I kind of addressed some of them.
Hi. You mentioned voting in Cuba. Can you expand on that and talk about how often they have a vote? And the new constitution, what has been the reaction to it by the people, especially the part about eliminating, child and elder care? That can't be popular.
So there's basically 3 levels of elected government in Cuba: municipal, provincial, and National Assembly. So the lower you get, the more democratic the system is. And I think one might say that about our own system too. That is, I think most of us probably feel like we have more of a voice at our local city council and mayoral level. We have more access to our elected officials. We really know what they stand for, like they actually campaign honestly on what they want to do in your city or town, and so you know what you're voting for, and you're more likely to work on their campaigns. I don't know. So so at the municipal level, in terms of local affairs, the municipal councils have a significant degree of autonomy. People don't run on party platforms, they run as individuals, just as in the Salem City Council, people don't run on party platforms. Like the mayor happens to be a Democrat, but she doesn't run as a Democrat against a Republican candidate. People just run on their own platforms. I'm going to represent my neighborhood by doing this. That's what the municipal level elections are like, and they have a strong degree of control over local affairs in the municipality. The provincial level, and then the National Assembly level. So the National Assembly has historically had the least power. It's been more of a rubber stamp. Those elections were historically more controlled. That is, until 1986, you had to be a Communist Party member to run for the National Assembly. Now, no, after 1986, no longer. Whereas at the local level, there was no party requirements at all. Anybody could run. But for the National Assembly, you had to be a Communist Party member. Again, no longer since 86. But the National Assembly also was basically a rubber stamp. That is, it wasn't a legislative body the way the Congress is in the United States. And the Communist Party of Cuba had sort of this para-state apparatus that had a lot more control at the national level than did the elected National Assembly. So you have these sort of two systems. You have the elected system, and then you have the party system, which is a sort of top-down hierarchical system. I mean, our parties are a little bit that way too, hierarchical, top-down run. I mean, I'm just saying that so that you can sort of see, like, the way things worked in Cuba is definitely very different from the way they work here, but it's not like Cuba's this horrific anomaly that's completely different from anything else. It has its own characteristics, some of which are democratic and some of which are quite undemocratic. So elections are every 2 years. The provincial, municipal, and National Assembly terms are 2 years.
Yeah, so these national assemblies, are there several, more than one party represented with just people on sort of ad hoc basis? There's a couple of questions I have. That's one.
Okay, let me answer them one by one, because otherwise I'm going to forget by the time you get to the next one. So there are no political parties allowed in Cuba except the Communist Party. Political parties, as we understand them, do not exist. And if you ask any Cuban official about this, or any supporter of the Cuban government about this, they will say, before 1959, we had lots of political parties, but we had no democracy. Political parties are not the definition of democracy. They're one way of organizing a democracy. But in Cuba, there's no political parties allowed. And as I said earlier, until 1986, you had to be a Communist Party member to run for the National Assembly. Since 1986, that has been eliminated. So anybody can run. And there are numerous people in the Assembly who are not members of the party.
When Fidel took over, what happened to the ruling class and the leader before it was someone named
Batista.
Yeah. What happened to them? Were they allowed to emigrate to the United States in some cases, or what happened to them? And there's a very brief answer to that. But I just wanted, if you could go over the relations, the trade relations between the United States and Cuba before Obama's reforms, during Obama's reforms, and after Obama's reforms revoked by our present leader or leader.
Okay, and I see that it's 8:02 and we were supposed to stop at 8 o'clock on the dot. So I'm going to answer really quickly. And I promised you I was going to forget the second question if you asked the third, so I did. What was the second question?
The second question is what happened to Batista?
Oh, what happened to Batista and the ruling class? So Batista fled. I don't believe he came to the United States. I believe he went to the Dominican Republic, but I actually, don't quote me on that because I don't remember where he ended up after he fled. There were trials carried out against several hundred members of his regime who were accused of torture, of murder, of political repression, and there were several hundred who were convicted and executed. But that's not the ruling class. That is members of the National Guard, individuals who were accused of crimes. The ruling class, the elite of Cuba, the majority of them broke with the revolution and left the island, most of them for the United States, most of them for Miami, in the first 5 years after the revolution, as the direction of the revolution became more and more clear, as their privileges, their access started disappearing. Some chose to remain in Cuba. That is, there are many members of the old elites, especially people involved in the artistic world, who chose to remain in Cuba and to participate in the revolution. And then the third question, so the US embargo on Cuba has stood since the early 1960s. However, different legislation, especially the Torricelli Law and the Helms-Burton, which were 1992 and 1996, took the embargo out of presidential hands and legislated it. So now there's only so much that is prior to the Torricelli Law. It was really in the hands of the president how the embargo would be, what the embargo was, and the executive, and how it would be implemented. These two laws legislated the embargo, so it would have to be, those would have to be changed by Congress. Nevertheless, the president has the right to suspend certain aspects of the laws, to allow for emergency aid. I mean, there's so much gray area around this. So one thing that Obama did was to raise the cap on remittances. So how much money are Cuban Americans allowed to send back to Cuba every year? And Trump has withdrawn that, so now remittances are restricted again. Travel to Cuba is another important part of the embargo. And every single administration, usually several times during the administration, has opened and closed the ability of US citizens to travel legally to Cuba and spend money in Cuba. So under what circumstances can we do that? And then there's the question of like the gray economy and the wink wink. When I traveled to Cuba illegally, it was 1995, it was under Clinton. It was at a moment when people who traveled to Cuba illegally were not being prosecuted. I got a grant from Johns Hopkins University, from a Cuban Studies Institute at Johns Hopkins that was run by a former US ambassador to Cuba under the Carter administration. And when I wrote to him that I would love to accept the grant, but I was just denied by the US State Department permission to travel to Cuba, he said, "We want you to travel illegally. We want to challenge this in court. Please go. We're going to back you up if you get into trouble." Unfortunately, I didn't get into trouble. But then there's other times when people who've traveled to Cuba illegally have been prosecuted. So it's in constant flux. Thank you all very much.